And I should say that title needs a question mark at the end of it. And yeah, I'll present something and then I look forward to the discussion. I also want to acknowledge the unceded and stolen land that we're all meeting on here. I'm on Ngunnawal country and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. It always was and always will be Aboriginal land. Thank you for having me, and Julia and Erin for organising the workshop. So whilst we're talking about climate reparations, I start from a place of thinking about reparations as justice for colonisation, slavery and genocide as the focus, and from there through the transformative work of reparations, what Taiwo calls the constructivist of reparations, climate justice could follow. And I guess, you know, at the heart of that there's no climate justice without accounting for colonisation, slavery and genocide and other forms of racial violence. So in the time I've got, I'm reflecting on a paper published in Critical Policy Studies titled Towards a Reparative Public Policy. And essentially the paper makes the argument for a reparative way of thinking, to use the term of Deborah Thomas, to unsettle and cultivate an anti-colonial politic in policymaking. I do this coming from a frustrated position, working in a policy school in Canberra. What I say to my students is possibly the most dangerous place in the country in the kinds of thinking that gets generated here, in a policy school wrapped up in the education and work of servants of the state, either within the bureaucracy, the university, contractors and civil society. There's often an assumption underpinning a lot of the policy work that the state is that policy is a neutral state technology, and if it's not neutral, then it's a force for good. This was, after all, what Harold Lasswell's vision for the policy sciences was, to quote, a discipline to improve the practice of democracy. Missing is much analysis, if any, as policy is a tool of ongoing colonial violence, which is absolutely the case here in the settler colony and, of course, abroad. And these assumptions of neutrality or a force for good are largely an ongoing feature of the policy sciences in liberal democracies, often ignorant to how coloniality, slavery and genocide are foundational to liberal democracy, as well as the maintenance of the settler colony. We see racial injustice and coloniality in the process of policy through exclusion, discrimination and epistemological violence, and of course in the outcomes of policy through the accumulation by dispossession, slavery, racialized state violence, and of course deaths in custody and genocide. So in the paper, I make the case that reparations as a process of justice for colonisation, slavery and genocide could, as a very small part in the broader work of justice, be useful in cultivating a reparative way of thinking in public policy. And I just want to say a small part, because just to say that I'm absolutely under no illusion that the state is some reparative revolutionary force. I absolutely acknowledge that it's a major perpetuator of injustice, of course, here in the settler colonials, in the settler colony, but also settler colonies, imperial states are some of the biggest barriers to the reparations movement here and of course globally. But it's because of this that unsettling and challenging their dominance becomes a central need in reparative work. So at a very practical level, this sort of paper is sort of speaking to a part of that bigger project, and you know, thinking about who is the state and what is the state, and particularly honing in on the sort of very sort of front lines of state negotiations and discussions on and work on reparations. Thinking about the work of public servants, project managers, lawyers, negotiators, diplomats, who voice the wishes of the state. So I'm thinking about a lot of testimony regarding COP negotiations with the West and how violent those negotiations are, but also a lot of, reflections coming from settlement negotiations between First Nations people here and the Australian state, and how violent those negotiations are, how colonial those negotiations are. So these workers are running the designing and implementing of public policy that does both the fast and slow violence of colonial and ecological dispossession. So the question is, thinking about unsettling these kinds of processes and wondering about the work of a reparative way of thinking to do that. I do think this links into what Harjeet was speaking about yesterday when he was talking about a need for a culture of reparations, but also beautifully illustrated by Richard Bell's digital work, Pay the Rent. And I just want to see if I can share this. I think makes the point really clearly. His work displayed an ever-increasing number of debts owed to First Nations people by the Australian government since Federation in 1901. I actually can't even read you the number. I don't actually know how to say that number, but that it's a very big number. And I think that's the point, right? Is that value glowing in red does other work for us. It is a claim on monetary demands, but it's also a cultural and political mirror into our colonial lives. It's an economic and cultural jolt. In an interview about this installation, Bell said, quote, "It's too expensive to play this colonisation game. Don't do it, because you'll never be able to pay for it. But we have to be smarter than that. We have to look for a solution, because nobody can ever afford to pay the kind of money that they actually owe." So, in that sort of sense, reparations and demands for reparations do work. They hold a mirror up to what must change. And it's that sort of reparative way of thinking, cultures of reparations, I think is another aspect that's useful in the struggle of reparations. And it's that kind of thinking that I'm wondering about what can be done in terms of unsettling the sort of space of policy making. Richard F. America has done some of this thinking. He says the concept of reparations will sharpen decision makers' understandings and analysis, and help them develop effective and different policy. So the paper is really trying to think through what is that sharpening, and utilising a lot of insights developed already through literature on reparations. And presents 4 specific aspects of public policy that together could inform a reparative procedural approach to public policy. Myself and Erin Fitzhenry have used some of this in our paper on just transitions, but also I've applied it in thinking around, particularly around welfare policy also. So the first sort of aspect is challenging and needing to go beyond methodological nationalism of public policy. This is the sort of positioning of the nation state as the central unit of analysis, and effectively omitting constitutive, violent and oppressive interconnections impacting the majority of the world's population. In the settler colonial context, the expropriation is within the domestic sphere, aided by the international, where the settler state is constituted through the ongoing acquisition of stolen land, life and labour. A reparative approach to public policy here would have a much greater concern for the interconnectedness of economic and the social injustice beyond the borders of the state and the publics that are of the concern of the state. Here in the settler state, it is clearly about challenging the terra nullius mindset, to quote Darragh Cronin, that sovereignty was never ceded, and taking very seriously what this foundational truth means to the settler state. Second, temporalities of public policy is, in thinking about the tendency in liberal time to narrow temporalities through, quote, what David Scott calls the fictive models through which temporal experience is discursively rendered, and in particular, the ways narrative models of time connect beginnings, middles, and endings, or past, presents, and futures. In the settler colony, Deborah Bird Rose talks of the settler time as the, quote, seemingly commonsensical orientation towards the future in a society built upon destruction, which enables regimes of violence to continue their work while claiming the moral ground of making a better future, end quote. So with this thinking, a reparative approach to public policy not only takes a much longer view of history, but centres history living in the present through the continued colonial and racialised way privilege and disadvantage accumulate. Put another way, attention to temporality in policy analysis can illuminate for policymakers how the so-called past continues to play out in the present. It can also highlight new ways of thinking about problem definition, implementation, and domains of so-called success, because colonial temporalities would be in the frame of analysis. Third is the space of racial capitalism, and there's much to say here, but a reparative public policy is attentive to accumulation by dispossession and the expropriation inherent in capitalism, and it seeks to make visible and unsettle these processes, including the economic functions of colonisation, slavery, and genocide, with their political functions, and engaging in the necessary upending of this structural destruction. Fourth is the embrace of self-determination and pluriversality, a public policy understood as honouring what Escobar terms the pluriversal. One size does not fit all, as we've seen again and again with the failings of development paradigms which promote modernisation based on liberalism and capitalism, as well as a linear progression based on the liberal democratic experience. Many reparation proposals have proposed alternative economic and social configurations seeking to break with coloniality and racialised capitalism. This is very real in the settler colonial context, which sees reparations as not just monetary compensation, but also truth-telling, land back, and of course, self-determination, which includes non-colonial self-government, but also in the space of climate justice around reconfiguring ecological relations and other anti-colonial, ecologically just world-making initiatives and alternatives. So the paper then goes on to talk about what does this sort of thinking mean for particular processes and aspects of policy making. It talks about how thinking through with these ideas, thinking about what it means for policy analysis and problem definition. It thinks about decision making and particularly challenging the subjectivities of decision makers, but also advocating for a humility and a spirit in which settlers and colonial beneficiaries might turn up in our work as policymakers. And of course, the allocation of resources, which of course is about reparations, monetary reparations, but also thinking about where the money is coming from, and thinking about the systems of generation of capital. I'll stop there. I realise the time, but again, I just want to say that this is, I guess, a small aspect of thinking about reparations, and I don't believe it's the question. It's here to definitely not hijack questions of justice, but the critical work of social movements. But I do think reparations as a demand does important political work that reverberates beyond the demands of communities seeking justice, and it does work on colonisers too. And I think it's useful to think about how that might unsettle the dominance of the state in getting in the way of justice. Thank you.